I'm excited to welcome you to my channel. Before I dive into my story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The alarm clock's soft buzz broke the silence of the early morning, pulling me from a restless sleep. I reached over to turn it off, the familiar sound anchoring me to the reality of the day. The room was still shrouded in the dim light of dawn, and as I sat up in bed, a wave of memories washed over me. Today wasn't just any day. It was my father's birthday, the first one since he'd passed away. I sat there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. The early morning stillness felt different today, heavier somehow, as if the world itself understood the significance of the day. I glanced over at the corner of the room where my fishing gear was neatly arranged, just as it had been on countless mornings before. But this time, there was an emptiness in the routine, a void where my father's presence used to be. His old fishing hat lay on top of the pile, the brim worn and frayed from years of use. I reached for it, running my fingers over the fabric, feeling the familiar texture that had accompanied us on so many fishing trips. Placing the hat on my head, I couldn't help but smile sadly. It was as if, in some small way, wearing it kept him close, a tangible connection to the man who had taught me everything I knew about fishing and life. Slowly, I began to gather the rest of the gear. My movements were deliberate, almost reverent, as I packed the tackle box with the care and attention my father had always shown. Each lure, each hook, was a reminder of a lesson learned at his side. He had a way of turning even the simplest task into a teaching moment, imparting wisdom that extended far beyond the water's edge. "Fishing's about more than just catching fish," he would say, his voice steady and calm. "It's about patience, about respect for nature, and about taking the time to appreciate the quiet moments." Those words had stuck with me, becoming a guiding principle in my life. As I finished packing, I took one last look around the room. Everything was ready. The gear was packed, and the memories were as fresh as ever. Today, I wasn't just going fishing, I was honoring my father's memory, keeping alive the traditions and values he had passed down to me. With a deep breath, I grabbed the tackle box and headed out the door, ready to spend this special day in the place that had always brought us so much peace. The morning air was crisp as I stepped outside, a welcome contrast to the warmth of the house. The sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, casting a pale blue glow over the world. I loaded the gear into the back of my truck, the familiar creak of the tailgate echoing in the stillness. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to embark on a journey that was both familiar and new. Lake Amistad was an hour's drive away, nestled deep in the rolling hills of Texas. It was a place my father and I had visited countless times, a sanctuary where the worries of the world seemed to fade away. The drive there had always been a part of the ritual, a time for us to talk, to plan, and to enjoy each other's company. Today, though, the drive would be different, quieter, more introspective. As I pulled onto the highway, the tires hummed against the pavement, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. I reached over and turned on the radio, hoping for a distraction, but the familiar country tunes only served to bring more memories to the surface. I could almost hear my father's voice, singing along to the old songs, his deep baritone filling the cab with warmth and life. I remembered the stories he would tell during these drives, tales of his own youth, of fishing trips with his father, and of the adventures he had experienced over the years. His stories had a way of weaving the past and present together, creating a tapestry of shared history that I now carried with me. The landscape outside the window began to shift as I left the town behind, the buildings giving way to open fields and stretches of brush. The hills in the distance were bathed in the soft glow of the rising sun, their silhouettes gradually becoming more defined as the light crept higher into the sky. It was a familiar route, yet every mile seemed to hold a new significance today. I found myself lost in thought, the memories of past trips playing out in my mind like an old film reel. I could see my father's smile as we approached the lake, the way his eyes would light up with excitement, no matter how many times we'd been there before. He had a deep love for the water, a reverence for its beauty and its unpredictability. It was something he had passed on to me, instilling in me a respect for nature that went beyond the simple act of fishing. The closer I got to the lake, the stronger the pull of those memories became. I could almost feel his presence beside me, as if he were there, guiding me on this journey. It was comforting, yet bittersweet, a reminder of what I had lost and what I still carried with me. As I turned onto the narrow road that led to the lake, the sun finally broke free from the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The sight of the lake, shimmering in the early morning light, brought a wave of emotion that I hadn't anticipated. This was our place, where we had shared so many moments, where he had taught me about life, and where I now stood alone. I parked the truck in our usual spot, a small clearing overlooking the water. For a moment, I just sat there, taking it all in. The lake was as beautiful as ever, its surface smooth and glassy, reflecting the sky above. The trees along the shore were still, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze, and the air was filled with the sounds of nature waking up, a chorus of birds, the distant croak of frogs, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. This was where I felt closest to my father, where his memory was most alive. As I stepped out of the truck, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Today was going to be about more than just fishing. It was about honoring my father's legacy, about keeping the bond we shared alive, and about finding peace in the place that had meant so much to both of us. I walked down to the edge of the lake, the grass soft under my boots, and took a deep breath of the cool morning air. This was our spot, the one we always came back to, and today, I would fish here in his honor. As I stood there, looking out over the water, I knew that this was where I needed to be, where I could feel his presence and where I could keep his memory alive in the best way I knew how. The sun was fully above the horizon now, casting a warm golden light across the lake as I unloaded the truck. The familiar sounds of nature surrounded me, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of a bird, and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. It was peaceful, almost serene, but beneath the calm exterior, I felt the bittersweet weight of the day. I walked over to our favorite spot by the shore, where the land jetted out just enough to give us a perfect view of the water. The ground was slightly uneven, with patches of grass and exposed rocks, but it was perfect, just as we'd always liked it. This was where my father had taught me how to fish, where he'd shared his wisdom and his stories, and where we'd spent countless hours together, casting lines and sharing laughs. I set down the tackle box and opened it, the hinges creaking slightly from years of use. Inside were all the familiar tools of our trade, the carefully organized lures, the well-worn hooks, and the fishing line that had seen its fair share of action. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, each item a testament to the countless hours we'd spent out here. My hands moved with the ease of long practice as I began to set up my rod, threading the line through the guides and tying on a lure. I chose a silver spinnerbait, one of my father's favorites, knowing it had always brought us luck on these waters. As I worked, I couldn't help but hear his voice in my head, reminding me to check the knots, to make sure the line was tight, and to always be patient. The morning air was cool against my skin, and I took a moment to just stand there, rod in hand, and breathe it all in. The lake was calm, the surface smooth and reflective, broken only by the occasional ripple as a fish breached. It was a sight I'd seen 100 times, but today, it felt different, more meaningful, more poignant. I walked to the water's edge, feeling the soft give of the earth beneath my boots, and cast my line out into the lake. The lure sailed through the air, landing with a gentle splash that sent ripples across the surface. I watched as the ripples expanded, slowly fading into the glassy stillness, and felt a sense of connection, to the water, to the moment, and to my father. As I stood there, waiting for a bite, I couldn't help but think about all the times we'd stood in this very spot, side by side, sharing in the quiet joy of the early morning. Fishing had always been about more than just the catch. It was about the time we spent together, the conversations we had, and the bond we forged over the years. Today, I wasn't just fishing, I was honoring those memories, keeping them alive in the place where they were made. The lake, the tackle, the act of casting the line, it all felt like a tribute, a way to keep my father close, even though he was no longer here. As the morning wore on, the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the air and casting long shadows across the water. I stood there, lost in thought, the rod steady in my hands, as I waited for the fish, and the memories, to come. The sun continued its slow climb, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink as the morning unfolded. I stood at the water's edge, holding the fishing rod steady, the line stretching out into the lake where the lure had landed. The tranquility of the moment was almost overwhelming, a stark contrast to the whirl of emotions inside me. As I waited, my thoughts drifted back to the countless mornings I'd spent here with my father. He had always been patient, content to let the fish come to him rather than rushing the process. Fishing isn't about speed, he would say. It's about timing, about being in the right place at the right moment. His words were a reminder to slow down, to appreciate the world around me, and to find peace in the stillness. The rod felt comfortable in my hands, like an old friend. Every scratch and nick on its surface told a story of days spent under the sun, of battles with stubborn fish, and of the shared experiences that had shaped our bond. I could almost hear my father's voice in the gentle rustle of the leaves, guiding me through each step of the process, as he had done so many times before. A soft breeze stirred the water, creating small ripples that danced across the surface. I watched them, mesmerized by the way they seemed to stretch out endlessly, as if inviting me to follow them into the depths of the lake. The world around me felt alive with the energy of the day, yet there was a calmness that settled over everything, a sense of quiet reverence. Suddenly, I felt a faint tug on the line, a subtle movement that sent a thrill of anticipation through me. My grip tightened instinctively, the muscles in my arms tensing as I prepared to reel in the catch. For a moment, I hesitated, remembering how my father would always remind me to stay calm, to let the fish take the bait fully before setting the hook. Taking a deep breath, I waited, letting the moment stretch out, savoring the connection between myself, the fish, and the water. The tug came again, stronger this time, and I knew it was time. With a swift motion, I jerked the rod back, feeling the resistance on the other end as the hook found its mark. The fish fought back, pulling against the line with surprising strength. My heart raced as I began to reel it in, each crank of the reel bringing me closer to the catch. The struggle was familiar, almost comforting, a dance I had performed countless times with my father by my side. I could feel his presence now, guiding my movements, steadying my hand. As the fish neared the surface, its silvery scales glinting in the sunlight, I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't the biggest catch, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the act itself, the connection to my father, the honoring of his memory, and the continuation of a tradition that had meant so much to both of us. Carefully, I brought the fish to shore, lifting it out of the water with a sense of quiet triumph. I held it up for a moment, watching as it thrashed in the morning light, before gently releasing it back into the lake. It swam away quickly, disappearing into the depths, leaving behind only a ripple on the surface. As the water stilled once more, I whispered, "This one's for you, Dad." The words felt right, a tribute not just to the man who had taught me everything I knew about fishing, but to the bond we shared, a bond that would endure, even now. I stood there for a while, watching the ripples fade and the lake return to its peaceful stillness. The satisfaction of that first catch lingered, but it was the quiet connection to my father that resonated most deeply. I felt a sense of calm, a kind of closure, yet I also knew the day was far from over. There were still many more casts to make, and with each one, I hoped to relive a bit more of our time together. As I prepared to cast again, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. Turning around, I noticed an older man walking towards me, a fishing rod in one hand and a small tackle box in the other. He moved with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had spent many years on the water. His weathered face, creased with lines from years under the sun, softened into a smile as he approached. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice warm and friendly. "Not at all," I replied, gesturing to the spot next to me. "Plenty of room here." He set his gear down beside mine and extended a hand. "Name's Hank," he said. "Good to meet you, Hank." "I'm Jake," I responded, shaking his hand. Hank settled in, assembling his rod with practiced ease. I could tell he was a seasoned fisherman, someone who knew the lake as well as anyone. As we both stood by the water, casting our lines into the quiet lake, a comfortable silence settled between us. There was something unspoken that connected us, perhaps a shared understanding of why we were out here on this quiet morning. After a few minutes, Hank broke the silence. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Perfect day for fishing. I nodded. Sure is. This place has always been special to me and my father. We used to come here all the time. Hank glanced over at me, his eyes kind but knowing. Lost him recently? Yeah, I said, the word catching slightly in my throat. Last year. Today's his birthday. Hank didn't say anything at first, just nodded, as if he understood exactly what I was feeling. I lost my old man a few years back, he finally said. Took me a while to come back out here. But when I did, it felt like he was right here with me, you know? I did know. It was exactly what I was feeling, a presence, a connection that went beyond the physical. As Hank and I continued to fish, we fell into an easy rhythm, casting our lines and occasionally exchanging a few words. There was no need for deep conversation. The lake, the fishing, and the memories were enough to fill the space between us. As the morning wore on, the sun climbed higher, warming the cool air and casting long shadows over the water. Hank shared a few stories about his own father, tales of early morning fishing trips and the lessons he had learned. I found myself doing the same, talking about my father's love for fishing and the many things he had taught me over the years. In sharing these stories, it felt as though we were not only keeping our father's memories alive, but also forging a new connection, built on shared experiences and a mutual respect for the traditions we had inherited. It was a reminder that while loss is inevitable, the bonds we create, whether through family, friendship, or even a shared passion like fishing, can transcend time. As the conversation slowed, we both returned our focus to the water, the quiet companionship between us now as comforting as the steady rhythm of the waves lapping against the shore. Today was about remembering, but it was also about continuing, a tradition, a passion, and a way of life that would carry on, just as our fathers had hoped. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Hank and I continued to fish side by side, the silence between us filled with a quiet understanding. The morning was slipping into midday, and the lake had begun to awaken with more signs of life. Birds darted across the water, their wings catching the light as they swooped down in search of breakfast. Occasionally, a fish would break the surface, sending ripples out across the otherwise still water. It was one of those perfect days where everything seemed in harmony. After a while, Hank broke the silence again. You know, he began, my father used to say that the best days on the water were the ones where you didn't need to say much. Just being there, in the moment, was enough. I nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. My father said something similar. He believed that fishing was about more than just the catch. It was about patience, understanding the water, and appreciating the quiet. Hank chuckled softly. Sounds like our fathers would have gotten along just fine. He cast his line out again, the lure landing with a soft plop in the water. It's funny, isn't it? How the lessons they taught us out here on the lake seem to apply to everything else in life. I thought about that for a moment. Yeah, it's true. My dad was always teaching, even when I didn't realize it. He had this way of making everything about fishing, patience, preparation, respecting the environment. It was like a blueprint for life. Hank nodded in agreement. Same here. My dad used to say that the lake was the best classroom there was. Out here, you learn by doing, by observing. And when you make a mistake, well, you've got all the time in the world to figure it out. As we continued to fish, the conversation turned to more stories about our fathers. Hank shared tales of early morning outings where he and his dad would sneak out before dawn, the two of them trying not to wake the rest of the house. They'd drive out to a secluded spot on the lake, where his father would tell him the old fishing tales handed down from his grandfather. Hank's eyes lit up as he recounted the excitement of those mornings, the anticipation, the thrill of the first bite, and the simple joy of being out on the water together. I found myself opening up as well, sharing stories of my own childhood fishing trips. I talked about how my father's patience seemed endless, how he would let me fumble through tying a knot for what felt like hours until I finally got it right. He never got frustrated, never took the rod from my hands. Instead, he'd stand beside me, offering gentle guidance, his calm presence a constant reassurance. There was something therapeutic about sharing these memories with Hank. It felt like a way to honor our fathers, to keep their spirits alive in the stories we told and the lessons we remembered. As the day wore on, the bond between us grew stronger, not just as two fishermen, but as sons who had loved and learned from their fathers. The sun was high in the sky now, its rays glinting off the water, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The heat was beginning to settle in, but neither of us seemed eager to leave. There was still something special about this day, something that kept us both there by the water's edge, rods in hand, memories in our hearts. As the sun reached its peak, the heat began to weigh down the air, making the water shimmer under its intense rays. Hank and I had been fishing quietly for a while, each lost in our own thoughts, when suddenly I felt a strong tug on my line. It was more powerful than the first fish I'd caught earlier, and my heart skipped a beat as I tightened my grip on the rod. "Got something?" Hank asked, glancing over with a knowing smile. "Feels like it," I replied, focusing all my attention on the battle unfolding beneath the water's surface. The fish was strong, pulling hard against the line, testing the limits of my patience and skill. I began to reel it in, slowly and steadily, just as my father had taught me. The rod bent under the strain, and I could feel the fish darting back and forth, trying to shake free. "Easy does it," Hank advised, watching intently. "Let it tire itself out." I nodded, keeping the tension on the line, but giving the fish enough slack to avoid snapping it. My heart pounded in my chest as I felt the fish dive deeper, pulling with a force that made my arms ache. It was the kind of struggle that every fisherman dreams of, a battle of wills between man and nature. For a few moments, it seemed like I was gaining the upper hand. The fish was coming closer, and I could just make out a flash of silver beneath the water. But then, with a sudden, powerful surge, it made a final, desperate lunge, and I felt the line go slack. The rod snapped back, nearly pulling me off balance, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The fish was gone. The line dangled limply from the end of the rod, the hook and lure missing. It had broken free, taking my best spinnerbait with it. Hank chuckled softly, a sound full of understanding rather than amusement. "Looks like that one's going to be telling stories of the one that got away." I couldn't help but smile, despite the disappointment. "Yeah, I guess so," I said, reeling in the empty line. "That was a big one. I could feel it." "Sometimes, those are the best kind," Hank replied. "The ones that get away, they keep you coming back, keep you trying. It's part of the challenge, part of the game." I nodded, knowing he was right. My father had often said the same thing, reminding me that fishing was as much about the ones you missed as it was about the ones you caught. "It's what keeps you humble," he'd say with a grin. "There's always another fish out there, waiting to teach you a lesson." As I tied on a new lure, I thought about that lesson. It wasn't just about losing a fish, it was about the pursuit, the patience, and the understanding that not every catch was meant to be. Some were meant to slip away, to remind you of the unpredictability of life and the importance of perseverance. Hank and I cast our lines back into the lake, the moment of excitement giving way to a renewed sense of calm. The day wasn't over yet, and there were still plenty of fish in the water. And as I stood there, the sun warm on my back, I felt a quiet determination settle over me. I would keep fishing, keep remembering, and keep honoring the lessons my father had taught me, both in success and in the ones that got away. After the big one got away, a quiet lull settled over the lake. Hank and I continued to cast our lines, but the fish seemed less eager to bite. The sun had climbed high, casting sharp reflections off the water's surface, and the air had grown thick with the midday heat. The stillness was almost hypnotic, lulling us into a peaceful rhythm of casting and reeling, casting and reeling. Despite the calm, there was something in the air, a faint tension that felt like the lake was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I could feel it in the way the wind started to pick up, rustling the leaves in the trees and sending ripples across the water. Even the birds seemed to sense it, their songs becoming sporadic, as if they were hesitant to break the silence. Hank noticed it too. He glanced up at the sky, squinting against the bright light. "Looks like we might have some weather coming in," he remarked, his voice thoughtful. "Might be time to pack it in soon." I looked up as well, following his gaze. Off in the distance, beyond the rolling hills that surrounded the lake, I could see the faint outline of dark clouds gathering on the horizon. It wasn't unusual for storms to roll in quickly out here, turning a peaceful day into something much more unpredictable. But there was still time, and part of me wasn't quite ready to leave. Maybe a little longer, I suggested, hoping to get in a few more casts before the weather turned. It doesn't look too close yet. Hank nodded, clearly understanding my reluctance. All right, but keep an eye on it. This place can change in a heartbeat. We continued fishing, but the mood had shifted. The impending storm brought with it a sense of urgency, as if we were racing against time. I cast my line out again, watching it sail through the air and land with a soft splash in the water. As I began to reel it in, I couldn't help but think about how much fishing was like life, full of unexpected changes, sudden challenges, and moments where you had to make quick decisions. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, sending a chill through the warm air. The clouds on the horizon were growing darker, more defined, and I knew Hank was right. It wouldn't be long before the storm reached us. But I wasn't ready to leave just yet. There was something about this moment, about being here on the lake with the memories of my father so close, that made it hard to let go. Maybe we'll get one more before we head out, I said, more to myself than to Hank. I cast my line again, feeling the weight of the day in every movement, the memories of my father guiding my hands. Hank didn't respond, just nodded as he cast his own line, his focus on the water. The two of us fished in silence, side by side, as the storm inched closer. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made your heart beat a little faster, your senses a little sharper. It was the calm before the storm, both literally and figuratively, a moment of peace before everything changed. As the storm loomed closer, the once still lake began to change. The breeze had become a steady wind, rippling the water and rustling the trees in a way that felt both invigorating and ominous. The dark clouds on the horizon had thickened, creeping toward us with an inevitability that was impossible to ignore. It was clear now that we didn't have much time before the weather would force us off the lake. Hank and I exchanged a glance, both of us silently acknowledging the need to wrap things up. Still, neither of us moved just yet. There was something about the approaching storm that made the day feel even more significant, a final test, perhaps, or simply the realization that our time on the water was running out. I cast my line one last time, watching as the lure flew out over the increasingly choppy water. The wind tugged at the line, making it harder to keep control, but I held steady, determined to make the most of these final moments. The rod felt solid in my hands, a familiar weight that grounded me amidst the growing tension. Just as I began to reel in, I felt a sudden, powerful strike. A fish had taken the bait, and it was big. The line pulled taut, and for a moment, I was caught off guard by the force of it. My heart leapt as I tightened my grip, bracing myself against the sudden struggle. This fish wasn't going to give up easily. "Hank!" I called out, my voice carrying over the rising wind. "I've got a big one." Hank looked over, his expression a mix of surprise and excitement. "Hang on to it," he shouted back, his own rod forgotten as he watched the battle unfold. The fish pulled hard, fighting with a strength that tested my endurance. I could feel the tension in the line, the way it vibrated with every thrash and dive. The storm seemed to fuel the fish's energy, and it took everything I had to keep it from breaking free. The wind whipped around me, making it harder to focus, but I was determined not to let this one go. It was as if the storm and the fish were working together, challenging me to prove my skills and my resolve. The struggle reminded me of the lessons my father had taught me about patience, perseverance, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. Slowly, I began to gain ground, reeling the fish closer despite its efforts to escape. My arms ached with the effort, but I didn't waver. The adrenaline surged through me, pushing me to keep going, to bring this fish in despite the elements working against me. The storm was nearly upon us now, the sky darkening and the wind howling through the trees. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and heavy, but I barely noticed. All my attention was focused on the line, on the fish that was so close to being caught. Finally, with one last effort, I managed to pull the fish to the surface. It was a beauty, a large base, its scales shimmering even in the dimming light. I could feel the satisfaction welling up inside me, a sense of accomplishment that went beyond just the catch. It was about proving something to myself, about honoring the lessons my father had instilled in me. But there was no time to celebrate. The rain was coming down harder now, and the storm was fully upon us. Hank and I exchanged a quick look, and without a word, we both knew it was time to go. "Let's get out of here," Hank said, his voice barely audible over the wind. I nodded, quickly releasing the fish back into the lake, watching as it disappeared beneath the waves. Then, together, we gathered our gear, moving with a speed and efficiency born of years of experience. The storm raged around us, but we were calm, focused, just as our fathers had taught us to be. The rain began to pour in earnest as Hank and I hurried to pack up our gear. The once gentle breeze had turned into a fierce wind that whipped the rain sideways, drenching us in seconds. The sky, which had been so clear and bright earlier, was now a dark, swirling mass of clouds, rumbling with distant thunder. It felt as though the storm had come out of nowhere, but we both knew better. This was Texas, after all, where the weather could change on a dime. We worked quickly, our movements synchronized by the urgency of the situation. Hank threw his tackle box into the back of the truck, and I collapsed the rods, my hands slick with rainwater as I fumbled with the gear. The lake, which had been so calm and inviting just hours before, was now churning, its surface pockmarked with raindrops and tossed by the wind. The serenity of the morning had been replaced by the raw power of the storm, reminding us of how quickly nature could shift. Hank looked over at me, his usually calm demeanor now tinged with concern. "We better get moving before this really kicks in," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "Agreed," I replied, my voice barely carrying over the noise. I threw the last of our gear into the truck and slammed the tailgate shut, wiping the rain from my face as I did. We both climbed into the cab, the sound of the storm muffled slightly as we pulled the doors closed behind us. For a moment, we just sat there, catching our breath and listening to the rain hammering against the roof. The storm seemed to engulf us, the truck rocking slightly as the wind howled around it. Hank turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life, a comforting sound amidst the chaos outside. "Let's get out of here," Hank said, shifting into gear. The tires spun for a second on the wet ground before catching, and we began to make our way down the narrow road that led away from the lake. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge, but Hank navigated the twists and turns with practiced ease. As we drove, I glanced back at the lake one last time, now a dark, churning expanse barely visible through the sheets of rain. The memories of the day played in my mind, the peaceful morning, the conversations with Hank, the fish that got away, and the one that didn't. Despite the storm, there was a sense of fulfillment, of having spent the day exactly as my father would have wanted. The road wound its way through the hills, the truck's headlights cutting through the gloom as the storm raged on. The rain beat against the windows, but inside, there was a quiet camaraderie between Hank and me, a shared understanding of what this day had meant. We didn't need to say much, the connection had already been made, through the stories we'd shared and the memories we'd honored. As the truck climbed the final hill, the lake disappeared from view, and with it, the intensity of the storm seemed to lessen. The thunder rumbled on, but the rain began to ease, turning from a downpour to a steady drizzle. The worst of it was behind us, and with that realization came a sense of calm. Hank glanced over at me, a small smile on his face. "Not a bad day, all things considered," he said. I returned the smile, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "No, not bad at all," I agreed. "Thanks for being out here with me today, Hank. It meant a lot." "Likewise, Jake," Hank replied, his eyes meeting mine with a look of mutual respect. "I think our dads would be proud." As we drove on, the storm continued to fade behind us, leaving only the gentle patter of rain on the roof. The day was coming to an end, but the memories made would last much longer, a reminder of the bonds that endure, even through the storms of life. This is where the story ends. Share your opinion in the comments. Did you like the story?